Welcome to Rights and Wrongs, a new weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Anthony Gale. Israel continues to make headlines for all the wrong reasons. There's been an increase in state-sponsored violence and tensions remain high. At the same time, it's becoming more difficult to report on abuses, as rights groups are increasingly being targeted. Recently, Israeli forces ordered the closure of 6 Palestinian rights organisations, labelling them terrorist groups. I'm joined today by Omar Shakur, Israel and Palestine Director at Human Rights Watch. Omar is somebody who has experienced firsthand Israel's attempts to muzzle rights defenders. In 2019, he was forced out of the country simply for doing his job. Despite now having to work in exile, he has continued to expose rights violations in the region. And in 2021, he wrote a groundbreaking report that found Israel was committing crimes against humanity, namely the crime of apartheid and the crime of persecuting the Palestinian people. Omar, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Anthony.
First, obviously, I think it's incredibly interesting that you bring your own perspective. So, could you give me a bit of background on why and how you ended up having your visa revoked and unable to work?
Absolutely. It was really a years-long effort by the Israeli government to muzzle Human Rights Watch. It actually began originally with the Israeli government in 2017 deciding that for them, Human Rights Watch was not a legitimate human rights organization, that we were actually propagandists, as they put it, for Palestinians. The minute that story went public, they sort of were embarrassed. It was reported all over the world. They started to backtrack. Eventually, the organization got a permit to hire a foreign employee, and I received a work visa under that permit. But soon after arriving on the ground, immediately pro-government NGOs began pressuring the government, including through litigation, to use different grounds, namely accusing Human Rights Watch and myself of promoting boycotts of Israel, which under new Israeli law is grounds, in fact, compels the Interior Ministry to deny somebody entry if they are supporters of boycotts of Israel. Of course, Human Rights Watch takes no position on boycotts of any country. We document human rights abuses by different actors, including companies, and call for them not to be complicit or contribute to rights abuse.
Obviously, supposedly you broke the law, although you patently didn't. What do you think it was about your work or the work of Human Rights Watch that put you under this spotlight?
Yeah, I think it was a couple of things. And this became clear from conversations we had off the record, on the record with Israeli government supporters, that for them, obviously there's a larger context of them, going after human rights organizations, which maybe we'll get to later. But just to say that I think for Human Rights Watch, the two things that particularly bothered them were our position in 2016 around calling for the International Criminal Court to open a formal probe into serious crimes committed in Palestine. And the second thing was a report we also wrote in 2016. And by the way, both of those things happened, before I joined the organization in this role, that documented the ways in which companies operating in West Bank settlements invariably contribute to human rights abuses, and our call for them to end those activities in order to comply with their human rights obligations. I should say, Anthony, that eventually the Israeli government ordered me deported in May of 2018. We, of course, challenged that deportation. They gave me 14 days to leave the country. We challenged that decision. The day before I was due to be deported, the Israeli government the court actually issued an injunction allowing me to stay in the country while we fought this out in court. So we spent a year and a half working our way all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court. But the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the decision. They basically said that even a human rights-based call on a company not to contribute to rights abuse is a boycott under Israeli law. It doesn't matter that we were focused on settlements, not on Israel proper, and in essence signed off, rubber stamped the government's deportation. I left the country forcibly in November of 2019.
And I think you touched on it in your answer, but is your case an isolated one, or is this something we're seeing being used against human rights defenders? Is the judiciary being weaponized, and is it, how systemic or systematic is that sort of attacks on organizations like yours or domestic grassroots organizations? Is that something that we're seeing happening?
There's absolutely a systematic effort to muzzle human rights advocacy. It happens at many levels. To start with, many are denied entry. This includes all the major UN human rights mechanisms. I would add that the UN Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights, their international staff, their visas were not renewed recently. They're now operating outside the country. There have been the UN special rapporteurs for the occupied territory haven't been allowed in, as well as commissions of inquiry. There have been other prominent rights advocates denied entry. Other international rights organizations have faced restrictions. For example, Amnesty International had a campaigner who held a Palestinian ID who was actually denied a permit because he's a West Bank Palestinian to enter occupied East Jerusalem, where his mother was receiving treatment for cancer. She actually died in that hospital without her son by her bedside. And again, they denied him on unspecified security grounds. He also wasn't allowed to leave the country. Israeli human rights organizations have regularly been accused of being traitors. Their funding has been restricted. But of course, Palestinian human rights organizations have always borne the brunt of Israel's repression. They've faced punitive travel bans, criminal charges, arrest without trial or charge, and most recently, 6 of Palestine's most prominent civil society organizations have actually been entirely outlawed. They were ordered shut. They were labeled as terrorist organizations. Their offices were raided. Their doors were sealed, and they face the prospect of any day, having their staff arrested. This includes Al Haq, one of the most prominent human rights organizations, not only in Palestine, but in the entire global South, that's been operating since 1979, whose executive director sits on the Human Rights Watch Middle East Advisory Council.
I think it's quite difficult to frame, but I mean, how do you, I mean, obviously, Human Rights Watch and other international organizations facing all of these barriers, these impediments being put in front of you, I mean, how are you able to work? How do you continue to work? And also, when it is so difficult, what keeps you wanting to work and wanting to fight and not perhaps going to work on another country?
I would preface it, Anthony, by saying what we face is just a fraction of what our Palestinian partners face, and they keep doing the work. So nothing is more inspiring than to see them. The day their doors were wielded shut overnight by the Israeli army, the community opened the doors for them, and they were back to work the very next day. In my case, Israel's not the first country that has blocked my access. Before that, Syria, Egypt, and Bahrain all did so over my human rights advocacy. The reality here is if I let the Israeli government's pressure stop me from doing my job, they would win, right? They would have been successful in blocking our work or in handpicking who covers it. We're not going to let any country have that ability. So we've continued to work on the same issues with the same intensity, with the same methodology. We're very lucky in Israel Palestine. We have staff on the ground, local Israeli and Palestinian staff who are excellent at their jobs. I work very closely with them, overseeing the research, looking through their notes. Israel's not the only country that's blocked this access. In fact, it joined the ranks of countries like North Korea, Egypt, Venezuela that have been doing that for us for some time. And we, find ways, Syria, to document abuses there using technology, using other means, video interviews, different methods of satellite imagery, etc. And in this case, not only do we have local staff, but I've been able to send in senior colleagues when there's particularly sensitive or tricky or research that requires expertise, all under my supervision. So we continue to do the work. We're not going to let any government, in essence, have the ability to block our work by kicking somebody out.
And I think that's a good segue, because I would like to talk about your work particularly. I mean, it needs no introduction. In 2021, you authored a report that continues to garner global attention, accusing the Israeli authorities of committing crimes against humanity, namely the crime of apartheid and the crime of persecution of the Palestinian people. I think, a lot of people, when they think of apartheid, immediately you think of South Africa. So I'd be really keen to understand how you apply the criteria of apartheid. What is the criterion? What does that look like in the occupied territories?
Absolutely. So let me start by saying, apartheid, of course, evokes for most people South Africa, but actually international treaties define apartheid as a universal legal term. It was actually, Anthony, activists from Southern Africa that fought to create a convention that dozens of countries have ratified on the suppression of the crime of apartheid. And the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, defines also apartheid as a crime against humanity. In essence, apartheid as a crime, if I were to boil it down, means really serious abuses known as inhumane acts when they take place in the context of systematic oppression by one group over another, and where that takes place with the intent by the perpetrator to maintain the system or regime of domination. So basically, you need the intent to dominate, the systematic oppression, and the inhumane acts. We did a prolonged, years-long piece of research where we did case studies comparing the treatment of Jewish Israelis and Palestinians who largely live in segregated communities. We looked at the Israeli government justifications. We looked at trends and analysis from more than 3 decades of our field work on the ground. We looked at the work of our partners. We put together a comprehensive 200-page factual account, 217-page factual account of how Palestinians are treated. And then we applied the law. And when we applied the crime that I mentioned, plus the crime against humanity of persecution, the facts were overwhelming that the Israeli authorities were committing these crimes. And happy to explain more about what that finding was based on. But it was a legal conclusion driven from us doing the work the way we do it in the 100 countries around the world we operate. Document the facts, apply the law, reach the conclusion that we reach.
And I think it's always difficult. I think, particularly in the work that we do, we come across a lot of sort of terminology, a lot of legal. I mean, are you able to paint a picture of what it looks like on the ground?
I mean, I think on many levels you can understand how Israeli authorities are committing the crime of apartheid. Let's start in the West Bank. In the West Bank, the Israeli government, let's say excluding East Jerusalem, you have nearly 500,000 settlers, and you have 2.7 million Palestinians. In this situation, there are dual legal systems. So you might have Jewish Israelis who are living in settlements, which, by the way, are war crimes under international law, and Palestinians living across the street. If they commit an offense, they're treated in different courts where they receive different due process rights, or more specifically, Palestinians receive no due process in effect, while Israelis receive due process, and they receive different sentences for doing the very same thing. In addition, in the West Bank, the Israeli government has not only expropriated or stolen, more than 2 million dunams of land from Palestinians. That's 1/3 of the West Bank. But that land, when redistributed, according to government data, 99% of it goes to settlements. Not only that, it's not only land, it's access to water, it's access to other resources. It's not only the dual legal systems and the land expropriations, it's the home demolitions policy. So in these areas, the majority of the West Bank, it's effectively impossible for a Palestinian to get a building permit. In fact, government data shows from 2016 to 2018, Israel issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians in these areas. In the meantime, the settlements, which are unlawful, are expanding at kind of accelerating rates. In addition, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, including from occupied East Jerusalem, have lost their ability to live in their city that they're from because they were abroad for too long. Of course, Jewish Israelis can go abroad, can live abroad, can come without any issues. Gaza, we haven't even talked about Gaza. Gaza, you have 2.1 million Palestinians who in effect live in an open air prison. So they cannot leave, or, there's no movement in or out absent narrow humanitarian exemptions, right? So even our staff person, who's a Gaza resident, never left Gaza until she was 31. So you might get, let's say you somehow magically, so the majority of Gaza's population has never left, right? So let's say, you get a permit one day because you're lucky enough, let's say you're accompanying a relative for a life-saving medical procedure. If you want to travel the next week to go to a training, to, God forbid, go on vacation, you're not allowed to do so, not because you pose a security threat, but because of a generalized policy. Now, I could go on and on and on, but you can understand the ways in which these policies around access to land, around your right to reside in the country you're from, your freedom of movement, the legal system, draconian military law being applied on Palestinians, affects the everyday life of Palestinians in innumerable ways.
So what sort of reaction have you had to the report from, not necessarily, people in Terry, but more so the sort of international community? How has it been received? Because it's obviously quite a contentious topic.
Anthony, I think it's interesting because I think for many people, they can't deny what their eyes see. And I think many people saw apartheid but didn't feel like they could say it. So in some ways, our report was a sort of permission slip. It felt like for more and more voices to recognize the reality for what it is. And I think one interesting trend that we noticed was, the report was released on April 27th, 2021. It was amidst Ramadan and a highly publicized Israeli government effort to force, several Palestinian families out of their homes and occupied East Jerusalem. And what we noticed is, like any HRW report, viewership was high on the day of release, the days around release, but the numbers started to dip until those events in Jerusalem led to armed hostilities in Gaza between Palestinian armed groups and the Israeli army. And we saw people turning back to the report. In fact, the numbers surpassed what they were on April 27th, which indicates that people were trying to understand what's the larger context. Why is that happening? So we've seen a situation today, when we look today at the 2+ years since the report, and of course, the report isn't the only trigger. Palestinian human rights groups have been saying it's apartheid for years. There have been other major reports by Amnesty, by Israeli human rights organizations, that there is a consensus today in the human rights community that Israeli authorities are committing apartheid against Palestinians. That consensus extends to more than 24 Israeli groups, to all of, in effect, Palestinian civil society, major international groups, the Harvard Law School International Human Rights Clinic, major UN experts, but it's gone beyond even human rights organizations.
There is evidence and there is a sort of groundswell of support for the findings, and also, as you say, of Amnesty's findings, but there still are impediments. I mean, from Israel, from its allies, what was the response you received about the report?
I think the response, Anthony, has been super telling because, it's been 2 years, and the Israeli government and its supporters have largely not challenged the findings, right? They have not challenged the way we applied the law to the facts or the facts themselves. I mean, let's be clear, if they actually, found mistakes, if they found, that would have been the lead story. But instead, the Israeli government and its supporters have sought to do something else. It's the oldest trick in the book. It's to attack the messenger. It's to try and reframe the debate around the credibility of those who are documenting the facts. And I think governments have noticed that. So yes, you're right to say that despite all the evidence I gave, obviously we still have major Western governments that still that bury their head in the sand and refuse to call it apartheid. Now, I've briefed almost all of those governments. Almost none of them in private meetings challenge our evidence or our facts. They rather say, well, some of them will say, well, maybe question why we chose to use this term that can be, highly, controversial, or more, or in many cases agree with us, but just explain that politically there are barriers to them saying this. But again, it's been very telling to them that there's been really no challenge to the facts and on the merits. So the fact that the Israeli government has tried to reframe the debate, they don't want the debate to be about whether Israel is committing apartheid, because that's a debate where they know the evidence is overwhelming and every serious organization that's looked at it has reached the same conclusion. So they'd rather make this debate around other things, to make it about whether we're objective, whether we're anti-Semitic. These are all, kind of allegations that have no basis at all in fact, but are their effort to reframe. But it's failing because we continue to see, just, this month we've seen Carl Bildt, who's the former, foreign minister of Sweden, the former, foreign policy heavyweight, as he's visiting Israel, use the term apartheid to describe what's happening in Israel. So clearly we're seeing this continue to gain momentum despite the Israeli government's desperate attempts to try and change the frame of discussion.
I think it's quite interesting with the countries you highlight, because they're not necessarily the traditional partners or bases that Human Rights Watch would target. Is that something with regards to this issue that you've been looking to advocate on, rather than going to, our typical governments who perhaps are Israeli supporters? Have you been reaching out to new partners and trying to sort of shift the debate that way?
I think absolutely, because the reality is the traditional partners, as you put, are the countries that, maybe are more vocal on Ukraine, on Syria. They've had clear double standards when it comes to Israel-Palestine for many, many years. Of course, the discussion of those countries matters. So we still engage their foreign ministries, we still engage. But the challenge in those countries is really to push forward the paradigm shift, So it's to, you have to shift government policy. You have to work with civil society organizations. You have to work with political parties. You have to work with legal experts to try and then, influence government policy over the span of years. We're doing that. We also brief the governments. But obviously, the UN system, the Human Rights Council, states have a powerful, voice. And so, we have been working with states and not some of the same typical areas we work in, because these are some of the states that have been the most forward-looking on Israel-Palestine. In some ways, the human rights dynamics have been different, and I think that's been a shift. We've also been working in partnership with civil society groups in many of these countries, groups that have presence and range in these areas. So it's really been a collaborative effort to try and work with these governments who in many cases are willing to say and do more, but want to know that civil society shares that view and is also sticking their neck out, because obviously there are ramifications when you're challenging a very powerful country that has key allies that hold a lot of influence around the world.
And I think this is probably less tangible and not something you can necessarily measure. But do you think the work of Human Rights Watch and their apartheid report and Amnesty and all of the Palestinian organizations that are pushing this narrative? I mean, we have seen recently, over the past few years, a sort of groundswell of recognition. Do you think that's having an impact both with Israelis and with Palestinians in how they have discussions within their own country?
I think absolutely. I mean, within Israel, the debate in some ways is more advanced than it is in parts of the Western world. I mean, you have former Israeli prime ministers. I mean, you can go back to the 1970s, and Yitzhak Rabin warned about Israel becoming an apartheid state. You can go back to Ehud Olmert. You can go back to Ehud Barak. I mean, these warnings are there. In some ways, the report basically said, it was titled "The Threshold Crossed," right? That it's not, and it may not have even been, even when these warnings happened, a hypothetical future scenario, but it certainly isn't, one today. And so, yes, in Israel, as I mentioned, you have senior government officials, you have former ambassadors to South Africa, you have members of the Knesset, you have every major human rights, or 27 human rights organizations the day the Israeli government was inaugurated. Now, has this penetrated the average Israeli? No. But that's a larger, discussion about the way politics in Israel has become today, because the Palestinian question is not at the center of Israeli politics. I mean, we're all viewing these protests that have taken place in recent weeks in Tel Aviv. The occupation, some protesters have raised it, but it's not at the heart of demonstrations, because largely the way in which Israel has conducted itself has been to make Palestinians, for most Israelis, largely invisible. And that has taken the issue off the forefront of the political. That's a much bigger issue. On the Palestinian side, they don't need Human Rights Watch or Amnesty to tell them what's happening. They see it with their eyes. They've been using the term apartheid, among other terms, to describe their predicament for years. They're scholars, they're human rights organizations, and they've been penalized. They've paid the price for doing so. So obviously, I think they welcome some of the shift that's happening in the discourse, but they also, will remind us, and we should be reminded, that this has not yet changed the reality on the ground, that the repression in some ways is unprecedentedly bad. And ultimately, the way we should all be measured as human rights organizations, how much do we change that reality? We have yet to do so. So the work ahead of us is to translate that paradigm shift into real change.
And I think that moves us nicely on to sort of perhaps the final point, which is, what is your outlook for the future? Because I mean, obviously we are seeing this groundswell of recognition, but where do you see the key moment, not necessarily the key moments, but the key actors? What needs to happen?
I think the reality here is European states have, and the US and Western countries in general, have long sort of been able to parrot these talking points, about the peace process, about, a temporary situation, the two-state solution. These are all fig leaves, right? I mean, a 56-year occupation is not temporary. Denying millions of Palestinians their basic rights because they're Palestinian and not Jewish is not simply a matter of an occupation that's gone on too long, right? A single system methodically engineered to privilege one people at the expense of another is not a conflict between equals. So the more vocal our voices get, the more vocal the voices of validators get, the harder it is for these states to continue to bury their head in the sand and to hide behind this make-believe world that years or decades ago bore no relation to the reality on the ground. Our job is to force these states to confront and deal with that reality. And I think that's going to reach a head point, because you right now have a parallel discourse. You have our discourse that's, as you said, gaining momentum, but you have states who continue, especially European and US states, who continue to pretend that we are in 1994. And it's the same conversation that we were having 30 years ago. And so our challenge is to hold them, to that. Now, I'm under no illusions. I think the situation could get a lot worse. I mean, we're already seeing, a record numbers of Palestinians held in administrative detention without trial or charge, more than 1,000. It's a 2-decade high. We see in 2022, we saw more Palestinians killed in the West Bank than in any year since the UN began systematically recording that data. 2023 is looking like it's going to outpace 2022. We see rounds of escalations in Gaza, human rights organizations outlawed. So these are trends that are going in the opposite direction. They may continue to do so. Our challenge, again, is to be able to start imposing consequences on the Israeli government for their actions, push for accountability, push for ending all forms of complicity in these crimes. That's going to take a lot of time, a lot of work. But what gives me hope, Anthony, is the fact that I don't think we've ever seen a moment in the human rights movement in Israel-Palestine of such a wall-to-wall consensus of different organizations with different backgrounds and mandates, Israeli, Palestinian, global, sharing such a similar assessment. I mean, our analyses have never been so similar. And it's not because, we've all undergone these radical transformations, because the reality is just impossible to deny. It was the honor of my lifetime to spend 2.5 years on the ground working with our human rights partners. We continue to work together even if I'm not there. And, I have a lot of faith in our ability over time, with, of course, the resilience of Palestinians on the ground to start to chip away and change that reality. But it's going to be a really long haul. But I have a lot of faith in the inspiration and visionary leadership of Palestinian Israeli civil society organizations.
Well, that's certainly something we can be grateful for. Thank you so much, Omar, for taking the time to join us today and sharing with us both your own experience and also your expertise on the subject. It's been a fascinating conversation. And thanks to everybody that's tuned in. Our producers today have been Christina Varganova and Blair Palmer. Our engineer is Kosi Ogbuli. And of course, I'm Anthony Gale. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next week.